I started to notice just the kind of tremendous amount of work that not only I was doing in trying to categorize and differentiate high school, college, what's the difference between writing practice in these different sites, female, male, and again, how do they relate to college? I was doing that work. And my sources were doing that work. And so that question of kind of how these categories get defined and how these practices get contained is this kind of broader insight into the work of constructing difference. This book is intended to tell a very particular history that helps us to notice the ways that we have been doing that and that we continue to do that into the present. One of the reasons that Louisville was a really good site to look at for a project like this is that, ironically, is the fact that the gender and racial segregation allows us to see kind of in, more clearly the ways that this boundarying work is kind of differentially enacted. And so there's this point of it kind of always happening, but also the point that it's happened differently at different sites in relation to different populations. In the 19th century, or in the first half of the 19th century at least, a college would be defined primarily by its curriculum, a collegiate curriculum being a classical curriculum. But in the second half of the 19th century, that changes, and colleges and high schools are both adopting an English curriculum or a modern curriculum or a scientific curriculum. They use different words for it, but it's starting to look like the kind of broader array of subjects in a modern college or university or high school for that matter, right? It includes science, it includes English, et cetera. So as male high school is working through these different iterations of its own identity, it actually parallels the story, the more kind of standard accepted story of college development in the 19th century that we might be familiar with in disciplinary narratives of when the teaching of composition began, quote unquote, and this whole kind of package of narratives that allows us to assume that prior to that in the 19th century, we weren't attending thoughtfully and theoretically to the teaching of composition, for instance. But when you look at these other high schools, female high school is doing something really quite different. One of the I was very surprised to learn early on about female high school is that they are having opportunities to speak in public about, and I share some examples in the book about some of the topics that are really quite politically relevant. They are not just reading kind of narrative or personal remarks, but they are in fact commenting on the world around them to large public promiscuous audiences in the 1860s. So this was not preparatory to college. This was what's the best intellectual offerings that we could offer as a community, sponsoring it out of this different form and this different curriculum. And the faculty and students at a school like Female, where in a way they were freed from that kind of preparatory role. They were freed from having to say, well, we need to make sure you pass this entrance exam to get into college. And so it allowed them to develop a different sense of what the highest schooling might look like. And it's also true for African-American students. The segregation of high schools actually was a surprising, what we would call in Rhetoric and Composition, literacy sponsor for African-American young adults in the community who needed to be trained to be teachers so that they had teachers for the African-American schools that they wanted to be segregated. So they had to sponsor the advanced literacy practices of students so that they could teach the other students, which they were, as the city was now responsible for doing, and that perceived necessity of segregating the teachers and the students created this opportunity for advanced education of the students who would go into those positions. Principal Maxwell was removed from his principalship at Central Colored High School. And the transcript of the board meeting of that experience, of that situation, reveals that at least part of what he was removed for, that was inappropriate for him to be doing at this school, was collegiate education, that he very explicitly modeled his education off of the debates that were happening at Yale. He says he was engaging in political and rhetorical education. And the Board of Trustees said, you should be teaching how to prepare people to be teachers in the schools. And what we mean by that is the rudiments of geography and grammar and simple mathematics. And they, kind of ironically, in policing that activity, they reveal for us historically the richness of that rhetorical and intellectual activity at this site. And that's, again, where those kind of boundaries come into play constantly, but in different ways, right? So in this case, that boundary is coming in, and rather than saying, oh, you're doing these things, we should assign you the title of college, which is what happened in the case of Mail. They said, oh, you're doing these things, and so we are going to remove this principal and make sure that you stay within the parameters of what we have designated eventually is evolving as a clearer idea of being subordinated, right? So the high school was not in that preparatory subordinated relationship until maybe the last quarter of the century or so, which is when Central Colored High School was opened, 22 years after male high school and female high school for white students. These histories are important to know for several reasons. When we are continuing to kind of reinvent the same insights and come up against the same, or at least similar or related constraints as we try and reimagine education, which we're continually reforming and reimagining literacy and rhetorical education. And some of these patterns can be traced historically and provide a different vantage point that then opens up potentially new solutions. And I don't know what the solutions are that are being opened up by this particular history, but they have something to do with this realization of the ways that we are creating and policing these boundaries between practices, between sites of practice, and imposing those on ourselves and on students engaging in literacy and language in other sites. So the connection that I make at the end of the book is to dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment programs today, which are, troubling this boundary again. And there's a very ahistorical way that gets discussed and experienced as though it's unprecedented. And I think it's important to understand these histories to see the very, very precedented nature of that contestation, right? The ways that these boundaries have continued to exclude populations systematically over time. And if we don't link our current attempts to think about these to historical instances where that might be more visible to us, where we can see the ways that sexism or racism is at play historically, then it might be harder to see the ways that similar kinds of exclusions are happening in the present. That we're continuing to under-resource particular kinds of high schools. We're continuing to value certain kinds of literacy practices over others, et cetera. And so I think it's important that we examine that ongoing boundarying work in our own work, how we continue to participate in that in our own classrooms. We're continuing to reinscribe these boundaries in our own shifting, ever evolving ways today. And when we notice that work, again, maybe a question like dual enrollment or a question of under-resourced high schools looks different when we start to see the different kinds of historical and discursive mechanisms that have been operating in the past and ask ourselves how they're operating today potentially.